Hi, everybody. This is the first lecture for Chapter 19 about the French Revolution. So we're going to start with the causes of the French Revolution. There's a combination of long-term factors that created the circumstances in which a revolution could happen, and then the short-term factors that made the revolution begin. So we're going to start with the long-term background. Number one, during the 1700s, France was kind of stuck in a rut that had been laid down by absolutist monarchs like Louis XIV at the beginning of the century. So you had a situation where there was a lot of power concentrated in the hands of the monarchy and the government that was employed by the monarchy. And there was there were no democratic elections. There was no representative government. The Estates General, the sort of, Parliament of France, had not been called in, well over a century. And the two kings who ruled France during this century, Louis XV right here, Louis XVI right here of the Bourbon dynasty, they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because, on one hand, even as France starts going down into a sort of financial hole that they can't get out of, it's difficult for these guys to try and really make a lot of political concessions, to give more social groups access to political power, because there are so many forces pushing back against them who want to maintain their privileges, and they're worried about sort of losing power and it becoming a slippery slope, where by giving an inch, their political opponents and critics will take a mile. So, in any case, though, in Western Europe and the colonies controlled by Western European countries around the world, like France or England or the Netherlands, big socioeconomic changes had been taking place. So even in a place like France, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, people who were making a lot of money as professionals, so as lawyers or bankers or merchants of some kind, or government officials, their prospects were rising steadily. And more money was coming into the country, more people were prospering. Now, it wasn't equitable, of course. Like, there was still an enormous class of people who were peasants or working class in the cities who didn't have the same kind of financial growth as people toward the top. But you did have this growing class of bourgeoisie who could only get access to political influence that they thought matched their growing economic importance if they worked for the royal government and were able to sort of work their way up toward the nobility. So you have a situation where you have a growing number of people who are becoming proud, who are becoming, dynamic, who look at themselves as the future of the country, but they're simply not represented in government that extensively. And the aristocracy and the Catholic clergy, these people still had special privileges. They were exempt from most taxes. They, had the right to wear certain clothing. And they just had privileges that sort of separated them and elevated them. And increasingly, the bourgeoisie just wanted equality. And the poor just wanted, liberty. They wanted the ability to just live a better life than they had before. And increasingly, they thought that the system as it existed just wasn't working. So, among all of these classes, then you have grievances. The bourgeoisie, they want to have political influence that matches their economic influence. They want to reduce the privileges of the aristocracy. The urban poor want, cheaper food. They want jobs that pay better. And the peasants out in the countryside, some of them are still stuck working for feudal lords who are very unfair. So some of them want to be released from serfdom or released from feudal dues. They want the rents they pay for land to be reduced or, removed altogether. So there's a lot of reasons why these huge groups of people feel like they're really not getting what they want from government. And increasingly, the government of France, starts becoming more resistant to giving these people representation because they're worried about where it might lead. So, especially among the bourgeoisie, but also among some aristocrats as well, you have the growing influence of Enlightenment ideas, liberal Enlightenment ideas, based on people like John Locke and the Baron de Montesquieu, and the model of parliamentary constitutional monarchy that England had set forth for France, or really for all of Europe. So among the bourgeoisie, you have more and more people calling for natural rights, for equality before the law, no special privileges for certain types of people. These are very sort of liberal Enlightenment ideas. Um, so, and from Montesquieu, you have the idea that government should be separated. You should have checks and balances, so you don't just have a sort of absolutist monarchy running amok and making bad decisions that can't be counteracted by other powerful people in society. So even among the aristocracy, this is important to remember about the French Revolution, some aristocrats thought that big changes needed to happen because they understood, like, if we don't start allowing more, people to participate, if we don't start reforming this country ourselves, then it's going to blow up in our faces. We need to change. And there were some aristocrats who just thought, hey, these are good ideas. They make sense. Let's do it. Sure, I'll pay taxes. That's fine. Let's just make our country better and more sort of forward thinking. Now, France also got into some military adventures that sent them into a deeper financial crisis. So first of all, the 7 Years' War, this was a major European war. Britain and France fought each other. Prussia and Austria fought each other. Prussia was allied with Britain. France was allied with the Austrian Habsburgs. The 7 Years' War, though, France was already losing influence in Europe, losing power overseas after, the War of the Spanish Succession at the end of Louis XIV's reign. They were still indebted from those wars under Louis XIV. The 7 Years' War, though, England just mopped the floor with the French. They took all of the French colonies in North America, Canada, the Mississippi River Valley, and the furs and the trade connections that they had with Native Americans there. They took some islands in the Caribbean. They took trading posts in India. So France now not only was the monarchy in debt already, but now they've lost a bunch of their ways of producing tax revenue. So now they're stuck in an even deeper hole. So then the American Revolution happens, and the French give a lot of aid to the British colonists in North America to help them win their independence. But once again, the goal here was to weaken Britain and allow France then to kind of fill in the gap in international influence. But ultimately this, just cost more money and put the French monarchy even deeper and deeper in the hole. And in addition to that, Frenchmen who were supporting the American Revolution and actually went to America, on ships to give aid to the British colonists, they just became aware of what was going on. And all this did was prove to them, hey, we can have a revolution that can actually be successful. So then finally in the Netherlands, there was a rebellion that began against the House of Orange, the stadtholders of the Netherlands as well, which we'll get to in a second. So in the American Revolution, Ben Franklin came to France, asking for aid. And he was a really just sort of, personable guy. Everyone liked him. He was witty, he was funny, he was charming. He convinced Frenchmen, including, aristocrats like the young Marquis de Lafayette, to actually support the American Revolution. So once again, they were successful at, breaking the colonies out of the shackles of British colonization. But ultimately, all this did was kind of spread revolutionary fervor into France. Now in the Netherlands, by the late 1700s, the Netherlands was kind of on a decline. They just lost a couple of wars where they lost some, colonial territory to the English. And in the 1600s, during the Dutch Golden Age, economic prosperity was a little bit more sort of evenly shared among the different levels of society in the Netherlands. But by the late 1700s, there was huge inequality. There was a sort of commercial bourgeoisie elite at the top of society. There were aristocrats like the House of Orange who were very wealthy and powerful. And you start to see then Dutch citizens getting a little angry at the situation. So they also then decide to take matters into their own hand in the 1780s. And there's an uprising by armed militias, citizens' militias against the House of Orange, against some of the elites in the Netherlands. William V of Orange actually flees to England for a little while. And this rebellion isn't totally resolved before the French Revolution begins, and to some extent it is kind of like the direct inspiration, because it's happening really right next door to France. So, now the short-term causes. Number one, the financial crisis, the sheer amount of money that the French royal government owes to bankers, to creditors across Europe and in France becomes staggering. Now, this is something that's sort of important to keep in mind. France was a productive country, a wealthy country. They had the biggest population of any country in Europe besides Russia. And the country was rich, like the country was productive. But the royal government was totally mismanaged and was in a deep financial crisis. So, increasingly, the deeper that the monarchy goes into debt, the more and more that powerful people in France, even among the aristocracy, become very critical of the way that this government works and really start pushing for more and more reform in order to kind of right the ship. Now, for a few years leading up to 1789, there's a food crisis. So unseasonably cold temperatures, crop yields decline, which means food shortages, prices go up, and this is really felt the most by people living in the cities, the urban poor, who rely on wages in order to actually pay for their food. So increasingly by 1789, you've got a few years of bad harvests and food shortages and rising food prices that just kind of make people really, really angry. And all of these forces kind of swirl together to the point where by the mid-1780s, people in France have just totally lost faith in the monarchy and lost their trust in the monarchy. And even some of the most ardent supporters of the monarchy still feel like some reform has to happen in order for anything to change and get better. So, now at this point, no one's like calling for the king to get his head cut off yet. But there still is this sense that the king cannot like hold on to, the old sort of style of monarchy for very long. So in 1789, after King Louis XVI proposes the idea of, increasing taxes, perhaps asking nobles to, contribute as well, there's so much resistance by people along every single class of society that Louis XVI is compelled, basically forced, to call together the Estates General, which is kind of a sort of parliament for France. But it's never as traditionally powerful as the parliament in England was, where it met all the time, or almost all the time, during the 15 and 1600s. And, the parliament in England, that was one of the sort of ways that England was able to, avoid really sort of extreme violence, as often as France will as a result of their revolutions. Because they had a representative body that, even if it was not totally representative of everybody, was able to absorb more of society and become a little bit more representative and protect the rights of and liberties of those classes. The Estates General, though, had not been called since 1610. So by the time that Louis XVI finally is compelled to call it in order to consult with him about new taxes and looking for a way forward, you have 170 years of like social just grievances against the monarchy that are just ready to kind of blow up in his face. And it very quickly does. So just to put this in perspective, though, by 1789, the king's budget, half of the budget was going entirely toward interest payments. And the rest was the army, administration, and the upkeep of Versailles. Versailles was also something that kind of offended a lot of Frenchmen. And, Louis XVI, the fact that he maintained Versailles, and Marie Antoinette, his wife, the Queen of France, she was actually a princess from the Austrian Habsburg dynasty. She was looked at by a lot of Frenchmen as, just like very carefree and not really concerned about like the welfare of the people. So there was this sense that the monarchy was just not responsive to the needs of the people. Now, the Estates General, the way that this works, in traditional French society, going back to like the Middle Ages, there were 3 estates. in French society. Number one, the Catholic clergy. Number two, the aristocracy, so the people who had noble titles like duke or baron or count. Now, the Catholic clergy, many of the high-ranking bishops and cardinals and so on were from aristocratic families. So there was a lot of crossover between these two groups. Also, the Catholic clergy and the aristocracy, they, owned a big chunk of the land in France, and they were exempt from most forms of taxation. So they had a lot of privileges that elevated them above the commoners. And the third estate, then, are the commoners, everyone else. Now, the third estate incorporated a number of different groups. At the top, you had the wealthiest bourgeoisie, people who were, landowners, ran huge businesses, were very successful. They just weren't aristocratic. Those are the people who really were like the most outspoken and critical and wanted to push for reform the most. But then you had people like the urban poor, the working class, peasants. The majority of French people were still peasants at this point. Some were still in serfdom. Others simply just lived a very sort of poor life in the countryside. So the way that this system was going to work, though, Louis XVI sent out the call, send your delegates to the Estates General to meet at Versailles in 1789. So among these estates, elections are held. And among the commoners, a third estate, voting rights are pretty restricted in the system. So the people who show up at Versailles as part of the Estates General are generally the bourgeoisie, people from the upper levels of the third estate. So lawyers, doctors, that sort of people. Now, according to the rules, the traditional rules, each estate would vote on proposals by the king by group. So the Catholic clergy, they would vote internally, and then whatever they decided, that would be the one vote they cast. Same thing with the aristocracy, same thing with the commoners. So this meant that, let's say, if the king proposed, hey, let's raise taxes on everybody, the chances of the clergy and the aristocracy uniting to outvote the commoners 2-1 was pretty high. So the third estate, they pushed to reform the system. And even some people from higher above them in society pushed for reform as well, because they actually wanted to have a fair system. So they allowed the commoners to send more delegates than the aristocracy and Catholic clergy combined. And the third estate, they wanted to vote by head. So they'd always be able to outvote the aristocracy and Catholic clergy if it ever, came down straight to party lines. Now, the king resisted that idea, and the commoners became more and more vocal and outspoken that this whole practice, this whole meeting, was going to be kind of corrupt, right from the get-go. So, now, there were some members of the First and Second Estates who were sympathetic to the commoners. In particular, one early leader of the revolution was a man named Abbé, which is a title for father, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. And he was actually a clergyman who was very sympathetic to the Third Estate and wrote, very vigorous defenses of what they were trying to do and the idea that the Third Estate really should be the representatives of the country. So he wrote a pamphlet in 1789 that, before the Estates General, became really widely circulated and very popular and influential, called What is the Third Estate? And very briefly, part of the introduction here, what is the Third Estate? Everything. He meant that most of the population were commoners, were part of the Third Estate. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. They have no political influence, no access to the levers of power. Their rights are not the same as those above them. What does it want to be? Something. So, he didn't want radical change. He didn't think we need to just turn the system on its head. He said these people should have some rights. They should have some representation. That's not too much to ask, is it? So, now, the Third Estate then, increasingly leading up to the Estates General, they had the sense that they were the ones who really were the people of France. And the First and Second Estates were just these fat cats, these bigwigs, riding on the back of all their hard work. So, at the Estates General, the Third Estate awakened. And this is when the revolution really begins. So in 1789, once the Estates General gets together, excuse me, the moment that the revolution really begins, to most historians, is in June. So, once this issue of like the voting system comes to a head, and Louis XVI simply just will not allow voting by head to occur, at some point he decides to just like literally lock the Third Estate out of the meeting hall where they had been meeting. So, once this happens, the Third Estate, all of their delegates, they try to find the biggest space they can in Versailles where they can meet, which in this case is going to be the tennis court. So this is the tennis court at Versailles. Tennis courts were all indoors at that point. So the delegates there, once they get locked out of the Estates General, they basically say, okay, well, you know what? We represent 95% of the population. Therefore, we are the government of France. We are the representatives of France. We declare ourselves to be the National Assembly. And that's actually now still the name of the sort of Congress or the representative body of the French government today. So they say we are the National Assembly, and we're going to take an oath to basically stick together to reform France and turn it into a constitutional monarchy, turn it into a modern, liberal, enlightened country. And they invite the First and the Second Estate to join them. And some of them do. Some of the First and Second Estate decide to join Third Estate in the National Assembly. And this is a critical moment because it's going to be difficult then for Louis XVI to just ignore them when you have some of the upper levels of society showing solidarity with the commoners. Now, Louis XVI, though, he decides to bring some troops close to Versailles, just in case he needs to use them. Once that happens, then you have a kind of second beginning to the revolution. So, the city of Paris, this was the biggest city in France, the wealthiest city, and this is the most dynamic with the largest urban population. So, in Paris, the people of France, the urban poor, the working classes of France, the lower middle classes, they're reading the newspapers, they're seeing what's happening at Versailles. And when they hear that the king is bringing troops to Versailles, possibly to put down this reform, to put down the National Assembly that's just been declared, they decide to take matters into their own hands. And on July 14th, a fortress that served as a prison and an armory in the city of Paris, under the control of the royal army, called the Bastille. Rumors start to circulate that Louis is going to send the troops in to break up the National Assembly, and you have groups, or I guess you could call them mobs, in Paris that storm the Bastille and take control of it, and raid the armory and release political prisoners. And essentially, you have this moment where the people of Paris, who aren't necessarily really represented by the bourgeoisie of the at the Estates General, really using direct action to make it clear we want something to change. So, by the end of July, now you've got a situation where Paris is kind of under the control of, the people. And the soldiers stationed in Paris increasingly sort of turn to the side of the people rather than, the monarchy. So now you've got Versailles essentially under the authority of the National Assembly, and you've got Paris under the control of the people, and this is really when the revolution starts to happen, when the changes start to happen. So, in France, though, their Independence Day, their national holiday, is called Bastille Day, and it occurs on July 14th every year. So, now, test your knowledge. Look over these questions and see how well you can answer them based on what you just learned, and I'll see you in class.